new book is called Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, written by our next guest, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. People are calling this book a game changer and a paradigm shift. It is must-reading for journalists, politicians, academics, military employees, and inquiring citizens alike. Steve Cole, welcome to the Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you for having me.
Explain the title, Directorate S. What does that mean?
It's the covert action wing of the Pakistani intelligence service known as ISI, and it is the group that supported the Taliban before we went to war in Afghanistan in 2001, and then gradually accommodated the Taliban and supported the Taliban as it came back at war with our forces in Afghanistan, particularly after about 2006.
And you write in the book that we were kind of playing all sides. We were on their side, helping the Taliban, as well as trying to hunt down the Taliban before 9/11?
Well, before 9/11, we were on opposite sides. I think we were trying to get at Osama bin Laden, and we were working with anti-Taliban guerrillas in Afghanistan, and we really had sanctioned Pakistan and kind of walked away from the relationship with ISI. Then, after 9/11, we went to the Pakistanis and said, famously, "You're with us or against us," and they decided to cooperate, and we worked with ISI after that to try to get after al-Qaeda. Most of al-Qaeda's leadership fled into Pakistan after we started our war in Afghanistan. And so we did have good relations for a few years, 2002, 2003, made some important arrests in Pakistan. But then gradually we turned our attention to Iraq, and ISI turned its attention back to Afghanistan and started to accommodate the Taliban's return to the Afghan war, and that's when the real frustration set in the relationship.
That's been a bone of contention, that sort of Tora Bora conversation. What actually happened? Why did we turn our attention away from Afghanistan and into Iraq?
Well, I think the president and his advisors, Donald Rumsfeld, were persuaded that Iraq was a necessary war, and they were also reluctant to invest in Afghanistan's reconstruction. So when you look back at the history, there's a section in the book called Losing the Peace that covers the story between 2002 and 2006. And why did we fail to consolidate the victory we had won over the Taliban in December 2001? I think the turn to Iraq is the biggest reason. You have military commanders from the U.S. going over there to try to set up counterterrorism operations, also establish some security in post-Taliban Afghanistan. And they go to meetings in Europe and come back and say to each other, you know what, let's not build anything permanent here because we're going to war in Iraq. We also failed to have a strategy to stabilize Afghan politics after the Taliban's defeat. We treated every Taliban foot soldier as a candidate for Guantanamo, and we ended up sowing seeds of bitterness that came back to haunt American troops when the Taliban revived as a guerrilla force.
The book is called Directorate S. Stephen Cole is our guest. Explain that. You write in the book that our torture program didn't help us and, in fact, actually hurt us.
Well, yeah, my treatment of the detention and torture subject, I tried to really set it in Afghanistan to try to describe how the brutality in these facilities and the lack of understanding about who was who on the battlefield also seeded bitterness in the Afghan population and allowed the Taliban to tell a story about American intentions in Afghanistan that we wouldn't recognize, but which Afghans who had suffered in some of these facilities did recognize. And in particular, I tell the story of an Afghan who was murdered by a CIA contractor in a facility in northeastern Afghanistan, essentially beaten to death. And there was a sense in those years, because of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques programs, that there were no rules, and the chapter is titled "His Rules Were Different Than Our Rules." That's a quotation from an American sergeant, an Army sergeant, who was stationed outside the cell where this beating was going on, and he just understood that, well, the CIA runs by its own playbook, and so I can't really stop this from happening. Of course, the military followed a very different code of requirements during interrogation. So it was a dark time, and it had consequences in the war because it caused too many Afghans to come home and say, you know what, the Americans are not much different than the Russians.
It seems like in your book, Directorate asks that at every turn we make the wrong decision, not just in the Bush administration, but also in the Obama administration.
We really struggled across both of those administrations, but especially in the Obama years, to define war aims in Afghanistan that could justify the huge sacrifices we were asking young men and women to make on the battlefield, and that were achievable. And, you know, at the heart of the dilemma were the Taliban. The Obama administration was very clear, the president was very clear that al-Qaeda was an important threat to the United States. Defeating it, preventing it from carrying out international terrorist attacks. It was still trying to blow up airplanes. And that was a vital interest that justified the war. But at that point, al-Qaeda was mostly in Pakistan, and we were sending tens of thousands of troops not to fight al-Qaeda, but to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. That was not a war President Obama wanted to fight. He didn't think it was winnable on any timeline or at any acceptable cost. And so the arguments about whether we were really at war with the Taliban or for what purpose are we at war with the Taliban really became an entanglement, and it really it still goes on to this day. It's part of the reason why we're still fighting 17 years later.
Talk about losing Karzai, chapter number 21.
So President Hamid Karzai, of course, was elected president of Afghanistan under a new constitution supported by the international community. And as one of his ministers said to him one day after the relationship with the United States had fallen apart, you know, Mr. President, the Americans used to call you an Afghan Mandela. Now they call you an Afghan Mugabe, referring to the former dictator of Zimbabwe. And it's not fair. Well, how did we lose that relationship? There were two main reasons. One was in 2009, he was standing for re-election, and the Obama administration tried to find someone to replace him and kept recruiting candidates to run against him. Of course, he found out about that. We ended up with the worst of both worlds. He was re-elected, and he thought the United States, correctly thought the United States was out to overthrow him. And, you know, the other reason was he couldn't understand why we allowed Pakistan to interfere in his country's war, why we allowed ISI to get away with its support for the Taliban. Every American who would come in to meet with him, he would say, you got to do more to pressure the Pakistanis. And when we failed to do anything to change the ISI's role, he sunk into a kind of conspiracy thinking, well, you must really want ISI to destabilize Afghanistan so you can justify maintaining military bases in my country. And so he became convinced that the U.S. had conspiratorial designs on Afghanistan.
Steve Cole is our guest for a couple more minutes. The book is called Directorate S, the CIA and the America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where are we now? We're not in Iraq. We're still in Afghanistan. We have apparently secret troops all over Africa. What are we doing? What's the goal now?
Well, we're actually fighting two wars in Afghanistan. I don't think many Americans understand that we have one campaign that's a direct war against a little branch of the Islamic State that has popped up in eastern Afghanistan, and we're going to try to destroy that element of the Islamic State. And then we are also in what is known as an advise and assist war with the Afghan security forces against the Taliban. So we're still fighting the Taliban, and we assist primarily by providing air power to the Afghan forces, but also special forces on the ground that are working alongside Afghan troops. Both wars are grinding along. I think there's some progress against the Islamic State, but against the Taliban, the war is a bloody stalemate and has been for a decade.
What happens if we just pull out tomorrow and say, that's it, we're done? 18 years is enough.
Well, it would strengthen the Taliban and the Islamic State, and it would probably result in the Taliban capturing cities. Whether the Afghan state could hold its ground is a question. But I think what most Afghans would tell you is that the country would fall into an even darker civil war like the one that they endured in the 1990s and from which emerged the 9/11 attacks. So one reason that across all these administrations, military commanders and political decision makers in our country have been reluctant to go home is because they don't want to rerun the tape of the 1990s.
Directorate S is the name of the book, The CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Steve Cole, Pulitzer Prize winner, as well as the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. Steve Cole, quickly, while we still have you for a minute or two, when I go and speak to young kids and I ask, where do you guys get your news from? And they say Facebook, as a dean of a journalism school, that must make you cringe.
Well, yes. I mean, Facebook actually doesn't create any news of its own. It just passes along other people's news. But
right.
Yes, it's a changing world. But the last year or two, I think, has been good for our school and for our students because we've seen a lot of pressure on journalism, but also a lot of clarity about why journalism is protected under our Constitution because it has an important role to play. And you've seen newsrooms doing great work over the last 2 years.
The New York Times is charging for their content now. However, there are a lot of dailies, including right here in St. Louis, that do not. Do you see that changing over the next couple of years?
I think it has to. Otherwise, local newspapers like yours are going to have a difficult time making a transition to the digital age. This is the big gap in local news, is getting people to pay for subscriptions when they've gotten used to reading newspapers, local newspapers they like, but they get to read them for free on their mobile devices or their iPads. And until newspapers can figure out how to persuade people to pay for digital content the way they used to pay for newspaper subscriptions, it's going to be a struggle.
Steve Cole, the book is called Directorate S. Thank you for your time and good luck with the book.